personally, I'm going to have to ask myself, the question and challenge myself, how do I merge this area of science and the history of science and the politics of science? How does one merge it and, merge it into liberation work, that one is doing now? How do we make it popular? How do we make it mass-oriented? How do we get this knowledge to the vast majority of our people, especially our young people, who are so enthused? Those are our warriors, those are our soldiers, but they need to be armed with information, strengthened with knowledge, because knowledge and information is indeed a weapon. So that, as they're forging on the nation state, that we're conscious of this knowledge of doing Sankofa, of going back into the future in order to bring it, to bear on our present, and our future. That, it seems to me, is one of the key challenges. But the other powerful challenge, which needs to manifest is this question of a federation of African states. I mean, one of the reservations that one has is that the states as we have them today, on the continent especially, are essentially neo-colonial states. And so a federation of neo-colonial states would be one horrible disaster if, they're run by neo-colonialists. But then, a federation of people to people. And it was something that was discussed, one of the issues we're discussing yesterday, with some of the comrades and colleagues, that were around a table with. This question of people-to-people solidarity, so that the issue of African federations, of us, going into a union, it's not just a government thing. It's not state to state, but it's people to people. And so one of the things that, we must push, all of us, is this fundamental question of the global nature of our African identities. That we stop, to see ourselves as Nigerians and Gabonese and, Ghanaians and Congolese and all these other nonsensical identities that we have. But not just that we talk about them like we're talking now, but that it's actually, embedded in our spirits, in our psyche, and in our approach to our work. Because those of you, who are on the continent know that we face, this crisis of religion, this crisis of ethnicism that is tearing us apart. And the only solution to that is going to, to start to address things and see things as a global body. And that when we speak of a federation of African states, we're not just referring to us on the continent, but that we are coming to the table with all of our power. And our power means the millions of Africans in the diaspora. That there's that clarity of understanding. So it's not something we just talk about or we preach about, but that we actually begin to implement in whatever, ways, we're working, whatever little areas of work, that we engage in. So I'll leave you at this time. And I know there's going to be a question and answer session, and I look forward to that. But like, Marcus Garvey's words, I always, quote them. They're internal. And, Sheikh Antedop would agree totally with that. Rise up, you mighty race, for you can accomplish whatever it is that you will. Kwame Nkrumah's words are also relevant. Says organization determines everything. And Sheikh Antedop was very clear about that. That organization determines everything. And of course, Fanon, standard Fanon. Every generation, out of relative obscurity, must identify its mission and either fulfill it or betray it. Sisters and brothers, have we identified the mission of our generation? Will we fulfill it or will we betray it? This is the question we need to answer ourselves. Thank you very much.
I think what we are suffering from is ideological confusion at the moment. That is, that we're not clear, we're not thinking clearly, and that we need a context within which to answer the question, is something good or bad? We assume that we have the same goals, but we never say what they are. It's time for us to think and articulate and establish our goals as Black nationalists and Pan-Africanists. We need vision, we need clarity. Otherwise, we can't answer the question, is it good for African people? Once we agree, then we can have a frame of reference and some ideological grounding. Well, let me just give some definitions or give my view of this. Nationalist goal is self-determination in the spirit of Delaney, Garvey, Malcolm, Amos. It is Pan-African commitment, that is the unity of African people worldwide and one Africa on the continent as a basis for African strength. So we are about building a Pan-African world order based on the principles of Ma'at, not in imitation of a European order. Ma'at as justice and truth. We need a nation concept, as Dr. Clark told us. A Black economic program, a cultural program, an independent political organization, independent Black media, independent African-centered education financed by us and controlled by us. All of this presupposes, very importantly, an African Black identity. Now, if we're not just paying lip service to what I've just said, if we really mean this, then there are some implications for this recent election. I want to touch on just a couple. One, the question of identity. Without clarity on this issue, there is no nationalist movement. There is no Pan-African movement. There's no reason for us to be here as a community. Without racial cultural identity, which works for us as a people and gives us power, then there is no reason for us to be here. That's the basis for our struggle. But what confusion about identity does is it works for integrationists. It works for assimilationists. It works for Marxists.
To retard and reduce the Black child's tremendous potential, there is one thing that must happen. That is the separation of African people from their African selves, from their basic African identities. When you have an identity, it is difficult for another person to impose a set of values on you, because having a positive identity and a solid identity is a defense against being penetrated by alien forces. A positive identity functions to locate us in the world, in space and in time and in history. A positive identity gives us a sense of purpose and a sense of direction. A positive identity provides us with self-knowledge and direction. A positive identity provides us with a sense of belongingness. When we say we are African, we are not merely identifying ourselves as individuals. We indicate that we belong to a people, to a culture, to a nation, that we belong to a system of values, a system of perceptions, a system of behavior, folkways, and mores. A system, an identity permits us to cooperate with other people. It permits us to understand what role we must play within a particular group. An identity permits us to know our own interests. An identity permits us to provide ourselves with an evaluative system, permits us to evaluate what is going on in the world. An identity provides us with a defense against possession. I've often said that we cannot be African and be slaves and subordinates of other people at the same time. We cannot be fully identified and at one with our African identity and be subordinate to another people. The European, of course, recognized this immediately. That is why when we talk about our slave history, we often talk about the destruction of African culture. We talk about the rewriting of Black history as an attempt again of destroying the African culture and an African personality. We recognize that the destruction of that personality, the separating of us from our culture, the separating of us from our history, is a separation of us ultimately from our identity. It means a split and a schism is created in the personality. When a schism and a split is created in the personality, the individual is made exceedingly uncomfortable. It is the first rule of brainwashing. When you wish to brainwash a person, when you wish to transform their personality, you break them from their old personality. You break them from their old moorings. You make them question and doubt their previous culture and their previous learning. When you get them to begin to doubt themselves, when you get them to reject their culture, when you get them to see their past lives as negative, when you get them to feel ashamed of that past life, when you get them to feel guilty of that past life, and any good brainwasher knows this, and you check out the Moonies and any other brainwashing organization, you will see this process being put forth. Once you get that, the individual then is left in a tremendous state of confusion, in a tremendous state of ambivalence. That state is painful. It motivates the individual then to seek some kind of relief, to seek some way out. Then it becomes the function of the brainwasher to say, if you follow my way, if you accept my definition, if you do it the way I say do it, if you look at it the way I say look at it, if you value it the way I say value it, then you will feel better. See how happy we are. You know, often in these semi or quasi-religious brainwashing places, you see the people running around smiling, and they're all glory, and they're all happy, and they're all loving, and they're all, you know, and here's this confused person cut off from family, cut off from his community, cut off from everything he's known, and is filled with pain, and yet these people seem to be so loving, they seem to be so brotherly, they seem to be so sisterly. Then let me get what they have. And of course, these people are here to say, see, if you thought the way we thought, if you look at things the way we look at it, you'll be happy, you'll be one, you'll be accepted. Then often the individual then accepts the values and the orientation of the brainwashing group and then becomes a part of that group. The splitting then of the African personality is a necessary process in inculcating into that personality an alien personality, an alien spirit, creating the personality of servitude. It makes possible then, in that African personality, that is the split African personality, makes it possible then for the African to begin to believe the lies, to accept the European distortions, to accept European reality, to accept then the stereotypes the Europeans have projected. And it's very interesting as you ride the subways today, and it becomes an embarrassing event to watch our youngsters use the degrading term they use again and again, so loudly, so unselfconsciously. When I grew up, the idea of using this term in public, the idea of letting white folk hear you using that term, letting any other group of people hear you referring to yourself by that term was unbelievable. But now this seems to be the coin of the realm. And we hear it all the time. Yeah, that nigga did this, that nigga that. And, you know, it just goes again and again and again. People must have been destroyed in many ways to talk about themselves in public and to be this way so loudly and so clearly. You must then break the African person from his African identity in order for this to happen. And this, of course, is what happens. Nature abhors a vacuum, we say. In other words, where there's a vacuum, there's an attempt for that vacuum to be filled in some way or another. And of course, we see that when we suck sodas with a straw, we create a vacuum, of course, and that vacuum sucks into it whatever we are drinking. When you create a vacuum in the personality by separating the African personality from its African identity, then there is an attempt for that personality to suck into itself something else, to fill its emptiness. When the European then is in control of information, when the European is in control of so-called knowledge, when the European is in control of so-called reality, in control of definition and so forth, it will be these things that are sucked into the African personality. When the European projects lies as truth, there will then be these lies sucked in through the vacuum of the split African personality and accepted as truth. And then this personality, these sucked in lies, these sucked in perceptions, these sucked in distorted views of reality will take on a life of their own. They will take on a structure and an organization and represent themselves as a personality. At that point, the African personality becomes possessed by a spirit. When we hear, as I said earlier, about the black boys and our children talking that language on the subway and speaking the way they speak, in a way, it is not they who speak. It is the spirit in them that speaks using their mouths, using their bodies. When they then believe the lies that they cannot learn as well or better than any other people, when they are afraid to try, when they are afraid of failure, when they are afraid of success, when they are afraid to challenge the European. You see, we talk about racism, but I don't think we are yet really ready to do something about it. Because doing something about it in the ultimate sense means preventing and neutralizing the perpetrators of racism. Ultimately, it means, ladies and gentlemen, removing the Europeans' ability to perpetrate racism in the world. Not getting the European to love us, not getting the European to so assimilate with us or to accept us, but getting the European in a position where no matter how scandalous he is in terms of us, he can do a doggone thing about it. Because we then have the power in and of ourselves to defend ourselves against his insult and against his slander. Ultimately, then, the removal of racism for the world would mean the ultimate neutralizing of European power. But many of us are not ready yet to take on that task. Many of us are still afraid that we are not up to that task, that we cannot defeat the European, that we cannot neutralize the European. So we have opted for some kind of armistice, some type of suing for peace, some type of getting along, because we figure that is the best that we can do. Then in this sense, then we will be continued to be possessed by an alien spirit. And that alien spirit then will speak to us. When we then fail to believe in ourselves as people, it is because that spirit has taken over us, and it says to us what the European has said: you can't succeed. You can't run the world on your own. You're incapable of having a culture. Without us, you wouldn't have VCRs. You wouldn't have TVs because, see, you're not technical, and you know you love it. You wouldn't have compact disc, and you know you're into your music, you see, and you wouldn't have this, and you wouldn't have that. Europeans are mathematically gifted, and you are not mathematically oriented, and Jews can count money, and you don't know how to keep money. That means that there's a spirit in us, and that spirit whispers to us, and it keeps us from attempting many of the things that we should attempt. This can only occur when we have been separated from our African selves. The alienated African then lacks insight and clear, realistic vision of himself and of the world, and finds himself at a loss as how to extricate himself from servitude and damnation. In other words, as long as we accept that alien spirit in ourselves, we will be confused as to how we are going to get out of our situation.